All right, so let's continue fleshing out this highlight section. And now that we have the markup, what we need to do is we need to plug in each individual stock's data, and we need to create some functions that operate on that data and determine which highlights to show. So if we go to our editor and we check out data.js, we have a data set here that we want to use to determine which highlights we are going to display. So if we go to our highlights component, right now we have this array that we kind of hard coded in here. But we don't want to hard code anything. We want this to be determined by each individual stock's data. So let's think about that. That means we are going to have to plug in the data here. So we'll have the data coming in, and that'll be the dividends. And then we are going to have to use a hook called useEffect to be able to handle that data once it comes in. So when this component mounts, we want to take the dividends and we want to create the highlights. So we'll create a function called getHighlights, and inside of useEffect we want to set it into this component state. So we want to add both useEffect and useState here, and we'll say const highlights and set highlights, and we'll assign that to the useState of an empty array. And now we'll hide this, and once we mount this function, we want to do set highlights, and we want to call on get highlights, which is this function, and we'll pass in the dividends. All right, so let's think about this for a little bit. So we have these three different highlights. So we have growing dividends, we have consistent dividends, and we have ranking. So what's going to happen in here? Well, let's ask three questions. First, are the dividends growing? And if they are, then we want to return an object like this. And if they are not, well, maybe we actually want to return the inverse. So we'll add another one, say declining dividends. And we don't have an icon for that yet, but let's not worry about that for now. So secondly, what's the second question we want to ask? Well, if we go back and look, we have a consistent dividend section here. So we want to ask questions, are the dividends consistent? And if they are, then we want to return an object like this. And if they're not, then maybe we'll go ahead and we will add the inverse here as well. So if the answer to that question is yes, we want to return an object like this. And if it's no, then we'll add a new object and we'll say that this has a type of inconsistent dividends and has only paid out dividends in, let's say, 3 of 20 years. Of course, that'll be determined dynamically. So thirdly, we want to ask what ranking does this stock have compared to other stocks. And here we are going to be returning an object no matter what. So an object like this. All right. So we have our questions here, and now we need to write functions that are able to answer them. So we'll start here by creating a highlights array. And this is going to take in the answers to these questions. So let's say highlights. And what we're going to do is we're just going to build out how we want this to look. And then we'll fill in the functionality as we kind of flesh out just how it's going to look. So we'll say highlights, and we'll say highlights concat, and we want to concatenate on the result of calling a function called determine growing dividends, and we'll pass in the dividend data, and we'll do accept the dividends here. And we haven't created these functions yet, but that doesn't matter right now. We just want to put in how we want this to look. So this first function is going to answer the first question. The second function, we'll call that determine consistent dividends. That's going to answer this second question. And the third function, we'll call that determine ranking. That's going to answer this third question. Now let's go ahead and create those functions. So we'll create determine growing dividends, and we'll return an empty array, and we'll create and we'll return an empty array here as well, and we'll create determine ranking, and we'll return an empty array. All right. So now we have to implement these functions. And if we go back to our browser, we can see that we no longer have any highlights. And that makes sense because our highlights are now being set to an empty array, and all of these functions are just returning empty arrays. So let's focus on how we're going to determine growing dividends. And if we look at our data, we have a data set here of years and amounts for each year. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2020 and I'll compare that to the amount in 2019. And if that is if the 2020 amount is greater, then we'll add that to an array, or we'll add a boolean to an array, and we'll keep going. And then we'll compare 2019 to 2018. And if 2019 is greater than 2018, then we'll add that to an array, and we'll keep going. And if 2018 is greater than 2017, then we'll add that to an array. And then we'll just check the length of the array at the end. So we'll go back 3 years, and we'll use that as kind of the baseline to determine whether or not it's growing. So the criteria is that it has to increase for each year 3 years in a row. All right. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to plug the dividends into the highlights component. So let's go to our stock view. And we'll do the same. We actually have the stock plugged in here. So we'll go ahead and grab the stock and we'll set highlight with stock.dividends. So I can make this a little more explicit. I'll say const highlights equals get highlights, and then we'll plug that in. All right, that's a little bit more clear maybe. So now inside of determine growing dividends, we'll go ahead and we'll say that const dividends equals object.keys, and we'll accept the dividends. I say const dividend keys. All right, and then we'll create a comparison array. So that's going to collect all of our booleans, and then we'll say dividends dividend keys. We'll reverse it so we get the latest keys first, and then we'll take a slice and we'll say 0 up until exclusive, so we'll say 0 to 3, and then we'll do for each, and we'll get the key and the index in this for each function. And before we do this section right here, we want to check the length of the dividend keys, and if it's less than 3, we'll return a empty array. No, we won't return an empty array. We'll return a object like this. And we'll store that in here, and we'll say declining growth highlight, and we'll return an array that has this object inside. So let's focus on this now. What we want to do is we want to compare each item to each other. So let's say const first item equals dividends and then key, and then second item or comparison equals dividends index plus 1. Not exactly. It's going to be dividend keys and index plus 1. All right. So that'll give us the first and then the next item in our array. And then we'll do a comparison. So we'll say if the first item is greater than the comparison item, then we'll do comparisons push true. And we'll also do if index is greater or equal to 3, we'll return. So that'll do the comparison, and if the first item is larger than the second item, we'll add a boolean to this comparisons array. And if the comparisons length is equal to 3 when we're done with this, Then we want to return an array, and that's going to have the type growing dividends in it. And if it's not, then we want to return an array with this declining growth highlight that we defined up here. So let's hit save on that. And we'll go ahead and check out what's going on in our browser. And we have an issue because we cannot convert undefined or null to an object. All right, so what's going on here? So we're trying to access the dividends and turn it into, or turn a property of the stock into an array with keys. The problem here is that once this component is actually mounting, the stock object will be an empty object. So what we can do to fix that is we can go to data.js and we can grab one of these objects and we can go to stock view, which is where we actually feed the data on to the highlights component. And we'll create a initial object here, and we'll just remove and initialize all of these properties to 0, but this way they'll actually exist, so that when we're trying to do object.keys on this dividends object, it's not undefined. So let's just reset all of these values to 0, and then we'll put this into state as the initial object. And let's see what's going on. All right, so now we have a highlights here that says declining dividend yields. And if we go back to our dashboard and we root, and we go into the different ones here, they should also pass in their data, and we use that to kind of calculate the highlights. But I think we actually made a mistake, because this should be a growing dividend yield stock. If we go to our data set and we check out this stock, then 2020 is greater than 2019, 2019 is greater than 2018, and 2018 is greater than 2017. So let's go ahead and see what we did wrong. We'll head over to highlights, and we'll go ahead and just console log our comparisons here, and we'll see what we get out in our console. Alright, so we get nothing out. So that means that we never get here. So let's console log dividend keys. I suspect that we are having an issue up here and we're returning too early. So we're getting an empty array here. Alright. So let's console log dividends. It looks like we're actually not getting our data properly through here. So let's see what's going on. Let's console log the stock. All right, so here's the problem. We are using this useEffect hook to run this once when it mounts. So when this component mounts, we are running the whatever is inside the useEffect callback function. But since we are only running it once, and the object or stock object is not initialized, or it's initialized to a 0 value when we start up, then we never get the stock when it actually updates. So what we can do to fix that is we can go to our stock view and we can add the conditional render here as well, and say that we only want to render it when we have a actual stock. So let's go ahead and go back, and here you can see that we now have growing dividend yields on this stock. And if we go back and we go to another one, then you see that we have declining dividend yields. And yeah, we'll have to add an icon for that, but so it seems like there's a mistake here. Alright, so I think what we'll do here is we'll go to our useEffect function and we'll give it the stock as a dependency. And now we should have the correct behavior. Alright, so let's go ahead and continue implementing the rest of these functions in the next video.